What do you do when the person who could destroy everything you've built is the same person you'd burn it all down to keep? We are about to hear this story right now. The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time Hermione reached the building on Callaway Lane, it had settled into the kind of steady, indifferent downpour that made the city feel submerged. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just relentless. The way grief is relentless, the way certain thoughts return at 3 in the morning with the same patient persistence of water finding its level. She stood at the entrance for longer than was sensible. The door was black lacquered wood, paint beginning to peel at the upper left corner in a curl she had memorized without meaning to. Second floor, third window from the left, the lamp was on. The particular amber of it, warmer than the cold sodium glare of the streetlights, was visible even through the rain-blurred glass, a small, private sun in an otherwise grey facade. She had not needed to check. She had looked before she knew she was looking. That told her something she was not yet prepared to name. Her robes were charmed against the weather, but the cold reached her anyway, threading through the collar, finding the bare skin at the back of her neck, where her hair, half escaped from its arrangement, clung in damp coils. She tucked a strand back. It fell again immediately. She left it. Third floor meetings run long on Fridays. That was what she had told Harry when she'd left the ministry 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Not a lie, precisely. Meetings did run long. She simply had not attended this particular one. She pushed open the door. The building had no name that she had ever discovered. It was the kind of place that existed in the older parts of Wizarding London as a matter of accumulated habit rather than intention. A narrow Georgian townhouse converted sometime in the last century into a series of let rooms, each with its own fireplace and a window that looked onto either the lane or a small, unkempt courtyard. The owner was a half-wizard of 70 who asked no questions and charged rates that had not increased since 1987. The staircase smelled of old timber, beeswax, and something mineral she had identified, eventually, as the chalk dust from the schoolroom that had occupied the ground floor before the war. She had found it by accident. She had continued coming deliberately. The second floor landing had a loose board, third from the top. She had learned to step over it in her third visit and had never mentioned it to him, though she had no particular reason for the omission. Perhaps because some things, once shared, lose the shape of the private. Perhaps because she wanted something, anything, in this arrangement that belonged only to herself. She stopped outside the door. Number 7. The brass plate was slightly crooked, its left screw missing. She had noticed that too, the tendency of old things to list, to lean, to hold their shape through stubbornness rather than structural integrity. She raised her hand and knocked twice. Silence. Then the particular sound of a chair adjusted, a small friction of wood on wood, and footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate. The walk of someone who does not rush toward things even when he wants them. The door opened. Draco Malfoy stood in the amber light of a single lamp, and for a moment Hermione did not speak, because there was always a moment. She had learned this, catalogued it, tried once to analyze it and abandon the project. There was always a moment when the reality of him required a kind of silent adjustment. Not because he was particularly remarkable to look at, though he was, in the way that difficult things are often beautiful. It was something else. The particular arrangement of his face, perhaps, so carefully composed and so legible beneath that composure to anyone patient enough to read it. She had become, over the past 3 months, very patient. He was still in his work clothes. The charcoal jacket was unbuttoned, his collar open, the silver cufflinks, always the same pair she had noticed, a small serpentine design, worn with what she decided was habitual attachment rather than affectation. Removed and presumably set somewhere nearby. He looked, in other words, like a man who had been home long enough to begin to undress and had not finished. Like a man interrupted in the middle of becoming himself. His eyes moved across her face before she had finished looking at his. "You're late," he said. "I'm early," she said. "You're thinking of Thursday." He considered this for precisely 1 second. "Come in." The room was warm in the way that only open fires produce, not the even, sourceless warmth of a warming charm, but heat with a direction, a center, a point toward which everything in the room subtly oriented itself. The fire was low, more embers than flame, and the lamp on the writing desk supplemented it with a steadier, yellower light that caught the grain of the old oak furniture and made the bookshelves along the left wall look like something from an illustration. Hermione noticed, as she always did, the books he'd brought. Different ones each time. She had stopped pretending not to look at the spines. Principles of Reconstructive Magic, 3rd edition. Navigating Wartime Statute, a Practitioner's Guide. The collected letters of Armand Malfoy, privately bound. She set her bag down by the chair she had come to think of, without irony, as hers. He went to the small table near the window, where, she now saw, there was already a pot of tea and 2 cups. He had known what time she would arrive within a reasonable margin, had prepared accordingly, and had said nothing about it, because that was the grammar of how he operated. In provisions made without announcement, in preparations that preceded acknowledgement. She watched him pour. His hands were steady. They were always steady, which was something she had initially read as coldness, and had since revised into something more complicated. A man whose hands had learned steadiness as a discipline, the way a surgeon's do, or a soldier's. Not the absence of feeling, the management of it. "You didn't use the flu," he said. Not a question. "It's being monitored this week." She took the cup he offered. Their fingers did not touch. They rarely did, yet in the casual way. Every point of contact between them had been, so far, deliberate, chosen. The weight of that was something she carried from one Thursday, one Friday, apparently, now, to the next. Routine audit, theoretically. Theoretically, he repeated, and the single word held a very precise quantity of skepticism. "I work there," she said. "I know when it's routine." He looked at her over the rim of his own cup. His eyes, in this light, were the colour of pewter, not silver, not grey, but that particular alloy of the two that implied both qualities and was entirely itself. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time arriving at that description and had shared it with no one. "And when it isn't?" he said. She did not answer. He did not press. They both understood this was not the conversation they were here to have. It hovered at the edge of this room, the other conversation, the necessary one, and had been hovering for at least 2 weeks now, gathering mass, acquiring the gravitational quality of things that cannot be indefinitely postponed. She had felt it in their last meeting, in the way he had paused at certain points before speaking, in the particular quality of his silences, which were never empty, but which had recently acquired an additional texture, something dense, compressed, like stone before fracture. She sat. He remained standing. This, too, was pattern. He moved while she settled, and then gradually, over the course of an evening, his orbit would narrow, the distance between them diminishing in increments so unhurried that each individual reduction was deniable. By the end of their evenings, she had only recently permitted herself to call them that, evenings instead of the more clinical meetings she had used through January and February. He would be close enough that she could hear him breathe. She thought sometimes about the distance they had begun with, and the distance they had closed, and the mathematics of it alarmed her. The rate of change was not linear. It was accelerating. "You've been thinking," he said. He had moved to the window and was looking out at the rain on the lane below. His back was to her, his reflection visible in the dark glass, superimposed on the wet street and the blurred lights. "I'm always thinking." "You've been thinking about something specific." A pause. "And you came anyway." The accuracy of this landed somewhere below her sternum with a quiet, precise impact. She wrapped both hands around her teacup and said nothing for a moment, cataloguing the warmth against her palms, the slight roughness of the ceramic rim, the smell of bergamot rising in the steam. "I came because Thursday, Friday, whatever this is now, is what it is," she said finally. "And I haven't decided to change that yet." He turned from the window. His expression was, as always, rigorously composed, but she had learned to read the places where composure was maintained rather than natural. The faint tension along his jaw, the way his eyes settled on her face with the particular quality of attention a person gives something they are trying to fix in memory. "Hermione," he said. He used her name so rarely. When he did, it did not sound like the name she heard from anyone else. It sounded, absurdly, like something he had looked at from a distance for a long time before allowing himself to say aloud. "I know," she said, because she did. She had known for 2 weeks, perhaps longer. "Just not yet. Can we just not yet?" Something moved across his face that she could not fully name. Not relief, which would have been simple. Not agreement, which would have been manageable. Something more like the expression of a man who has been carrying a significant weight and has been told he may set it down for exactly 1 more hour. Gratitude and sorrow in such equal measure that they became a third thing entirely. "All right," he said. He sat down then, not at the desk, not in the chair across the room, but on the small settle closer to the fire, which placed him within the same amber radius as her chair, close enough that the air between them had warmth and weight. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the embers, and she looked at the side of his face, the clean angle of his jaw, the slight downward press of his mouth, the way his hair had fallen forward from whatever order he'd put it in this morning into something looser, less deliberate. Outside, the rain continued. It found the gaps in the old window frames and made a sound like whispered argument, not loud enough to hear the words, only the rhythm, the insistence. Hermione set down her cup, picked up nothing else. Let herself exist for one rare and specific moment without the armature of task or purpose, simply in this room, in this warmth, within this particular gravitational field that had been altering her trajectory for 3 months without permission or apology. She thought, tomorrow will be what it is. She thought, but it is not yet tomorrow. Across from her, Draco Malfoy looked into the fire with eyes that were too careful and a mouth that was too still, and she could feel, across the narrow, warm, amber-lit space between them, the precise tension of a man who has also made this choice. To be here, to stay, for now, in the last hour before whatever came next made staying impossible. The fire shifted. A log settled, releasing a brief, brighter flame that caught the silver of his cufflink where it lay on the desk. She had been right. He had set them there, neatly together, the small serpentine shapes coiled against the wood. And then the light subsided, and the room returned to its patient amber. "The tea's going cold," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved. She had not meant for it to become a pattern. That was what she told herself in the beginning. Through January, when the meetings were still technically professional, conducted with the brittle formality of 2 people who had spent their adolescence in opposing trenches and had not yet developed the vocabulary for anything else. She told herself, this is circumstantial. This is the ministry's reconciliation initiative, nothing more. She told herself this with the same dogged precision she applied to legal briefs and arithmetic proofs, and for approximately 3 weeks, she almost believed it. The reconciliation initiative was real enough. In the 5 years since the war had folded in on itself and left the wizarding world with its infrastructure intact and its people fractured along lines that did not resolve neatly into victor and defeated, the ministry had established a series of working groups tasked with what the official documentation called cross-community legislative alignment. In practice, this meant placing people in rooms together who had, in some cases, watched each other's allies die, and asking them to draft policy on inheritance law and magical creature rights and the regulation of dark artifacts. Hermione had been assigned to the Artifacts Subcommittee. She had not chosen it, but she had, characteristically, mastered it within a month. Draco Malfoy had been assigned to it also. She had been told this 3 days before the first session, and had spent those 3 days in a state of controlled, furious preparation. Not for him, she insisted to herself, but for the work. She had arrived at the first meeting with 12 inches of notes, and the expression of someone who had decided that whatever happened, they would be the most prepared person in the room. He had arrived 7 minutes late, sat down across from her without apology or acknowledgement, and opened a folder that was thinner than hers, but which contained, she noted with reluctant precision, exactly the 3 sources she would have prioritized herself had she been working with less time. That had been the first small shock. Not that he was intelligent. She had always known that, had known it even when she was 12 and furious at him, had stored the knowledge away in the part of herself that catalogued things accurately regardless of whether she liked them. But there was a difference between knowing a person is intelligent and sitting across a narrow ministry table from them while they annotate a primary source with the same marginal notation system you developed independently in your 2nd year of university. She had not mentioned the notation system. Neither had he. That was the beginning. The second meeting had been shorter and more contentious, which was, paradoxically, easier. Contention she understood. She had spent years being good at it. The quick read of an opponent's position, the surgical location of its weakest point, the precise application of counter-argument. When Draco disagreed with her proposed classification system for Category 3 artifacts, he did so with a specificity that forced her to defend her reasoning rather than merely her conclusion. She had defended it. He had not conceded, but he had listened, which was not a thing she had expected from him, and which she filed without quite meaning to in a new and nameless category. After the third meeting, they had both remained when the others left, not by arrangement, but by the simultaneous gravity of an unresolved point. They had stood at opposite ends of the table. She, with her annotated copy of the Artifact Restriction Act, he, with his jacket over his arm, and 3 counter-arguments that she needed, privately, another 6 minutes to properly dismantle, and argued for 40 minutes about the jurisdictional application of a 1962 statute. And when they had finished, neither had entirely won, and the air in the room had the particular charged quality of ozone after a spell discharged into open space. He had gathered his papers. She had gathered hers. At the door, he had paused, and she had seen it, the pause, the fraction of a second in which something was considered and then arranged, and said, "The Abernathy case undermines your position on cross-border provenance, Granger. You might want to look at it before Thursday." She had, in fact, already looked at the Abernathy case. She had looked at it, cross-referenced it, and arrived at a reading that she was fairly confident undermined his position. She had opened her mouth to say this, and then, for reasons she did not immediately examine, closed it. "I'll consider it," she'd said instead. He had left. She had stood in the empty room for a moment, looking at the door, and thought that was a recommendation, not a taunt, not a dismissal. He had given her something useful and called it an argument, because neither of them was yet equipped to call it anything else. By February, the professional rationale had developed complications. The meetings had begun to extend past their scheduled time in increments that neither of them formally acknowledged. First by 20 minutes, which was explainable, then by an hour, which required some internal negotiation. Then by the particular variety of extended conversation that has nothing to do with the original agenda and everything to do with the specific gravitational pull between 2 people who are discovering, with some alarm, that they are more interesting to each other than almost anyone else they know. It had happened, as these things do, obliquely. A reference she made to a secondary text he also knew, not a famous one, a minor theoretical work on the ethical inheritance of dark magic, the sort of book that had a small readership of very specific people, and the way his eyes had sharpened when she cited it, the brief, unguarded expression of someone who has mentioned a private enthusiasm in public and discovered astonishingly that it is shared. After that, the conversations had opened in a new direction. Not wider exactly, but deeper, down through the formal subject matter into the substrata of assumption and belief, the places where a person's actual architecture lives. She had found in those depths things she had not anticipated. A man of precise and uncomfortable self-awareness, a man who had examined his own history with a rigor she recognized because she applied the same rigor to problems she was trying to honestly solve rather than rhetorically win. A man who did not excuse himself and did not perform contrition, which was rarer than either. She had not told him any of this. She had simply returned, Thursday after Thursday, with new arguments and, somewhere beneath them, other reasons she was only beginning to inventory. The room on Callaway Lane had been his suggestion, offered in the neutral tones of practicality. The ministry's conference rooms were monitored, not always, but often enough, and both of them had interests in conversations that did not require an audience. She had agreed with the same neutral tone, and they had met there for the first time on the last Thursday of February, in a room that smelled of old timber and chalk and beeswax, with a fire that burned with its own specific character. And she had sat in the chair that became hers without discussion, and he had moved through the room in his orbital way, and by the end of that first evening, meeting she had still been calling it, she had understood that the ministry subcommittee had become, for her, primarily a reason. The actual reason was in this room. She thought about all of this now, watching the fire and not watching him, aware of him at the precise angle of her peripheral vision, the way you are aware of a source of heat, not by looking, but by the direction your body orients without instruction. 3 months. The architecture of it was, in retrospect, visible. Mutual antagonism to mutual recognition, to something that occupied no category she was willing to formally establish. Meetings that had ceased to require a professional rationale. Evenings that ended later and later, until one Thursday in March, she had looked up from a conversation about post-war magical theory and realized with a physical jolt that 3 hours had passed, and she had not noticed, had not wanted to, and that he was looking at her with an expression she could not identify except by the quality of its attention. The way a person looks at something they have decided, quietly and without announcement, matters to them. He had walked her to the building's entrance that night. At the door, in the lamplight, with the smell of early spring rain coming from the lane, there had been a pause, longer than the one at the ministry door, heavier with different weight, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its calmness, he is going to say something, or he is going to do something, and either way the arrangement of this changes. He had done neither. He had said good night in a voice that was several registers lower than his committee voice, and she had said good night back, and she had walked out into the rain-damp lane and stood for half a block before she remembered where she was going. Since then, there had been a quality to their evenings that she did not have precise language for, a suspension. 2 people circling a shared center without naming it, each approach and withdrawal recorded in the private ledger she kept, and, she suspected, in the private ledger he kept also. The conversations had grown more honest, which was the only word for it. The kind of honesty that is not confession, but excavation, a careful removal of the layers above what is actually true. She knew things about him now that were not in any file. The particular weight of his silences, and what distinguished grief from guilt within them. The book he returned to at intervals, not the collected letters of his ancestor, but a slim, battered volume of Muggle poetry he had found in his mother's library, and kept without entirely knowing why. The way he rubbed the inside of his left forearm with his thumb sometimes, a gesture so habitual it had become invisible to him, she suspected, though it was not invisible to her. He knew things about her also. She was aware of this in the way she was aware of being read by someone literate in the particular language she spoke. Not unsettling, precisely, but exposing in a way she was still calibrating to. He knew that she structured arguments when she was frightened, that her competence was also a form of armor, that beneath the precision was something that had been hurt in the war in ways she did not discuss, because she had decided the discussion was less useful than the reconstruction. He had never said any of this to her. He had simply adjusted his approach in ways that demonstrated it, which was, she had concluded, both more respectful and more devastating than being told. The fire made its small sound. The rain made its larger one. Hermione looked at the side of his face, the firelight catching the angle of his cheekbone, the careful stillness of his posture, the way his hands hung between his knees with fingers loosely linked, a posture of apparent relaxation that she knew by now cost him something to maintain, and felt, somewhere in the architecture of her chest, the specific ache of a thing that has grown too large for the space that was originally allocated to it. Not yet, she had said. He had agreed. Of course he had agreed. Because whatever this was between them, it had been built from the beginning on the precise and mutual grammar of knowing when to press and when to wait. And he had always, in this room, chosen to wait. The patience of it sometimes undid her more than any advance could have. She reached forward and picked up her tea. It was cold, as he had observed. She drank it anyway, and over the rim of the cup, she watched him watch the fire. And she thought, with the part of her mind that refused, even now, to stop being exact, that this was the most frightening thing. Not what was coming tomorrow, or the conversation that circled the room like weather. Not the conflict, not the sides, not the machinery of the world outside. This, the warmth of a cold room, the amber light, the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who has become, without her formal permission, necessary. She thought, I should have been more careful. She thought, I'm not sure careful was ever actually available. Across the narrow, firelit space, Draco turned his head. Slowly, the way he did everything in this room, as if speed might disturb something that could not be restored if broken. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire made its sound. The rain made its argument against the glass. Neither of them looked away. He spoke first. She had not expected that. In the private taxonomy she had developed over 3 months, the careful, unauthorized study of Draco Malfoy that she conducted without ever admitting it was a study. He was not the one who initiated. He waited. He responded. He created the conditions in which things could be said, and then allowed her the architecture of saying them, which she had initially read as reticence, and had since revised into something more like consideration. The distinction mattered. Reticence was about the self. Consideration was about the other person. So when he spoke, and spoke first, she knew before the words arrived that the evening had changed its nature. He did not look at her when he began. He looked at the fire, his forearms still resting on his knees, his linked fingers tightening almost imperceptibly. the knuckle of his right thumb going briefly white against the back of his left hand before releasing. "There's going to be a tribunal," he said. The word landed in the room with the particular weight of something that has been carried a long distance before being set down. Not dropped, set down, with care. Hermione did not move. She kept her teacup between her hands and kept her eyes on his profile and kept her breathing at its established pace through the specific discipline she had developed in the war, for moments when the information you are receiving must be processed before any response is possible. This was that kind of moment. "When?" she said. Not a question about whether she had heard correctly, not a question about what kind, just the first coordinate she needed. "It's been scheduled for 2 weeks from Tuesday." He paused. The pause had texture. She could feel the weight of what he was deciding how much to say. "Formally convened under the Reconstructive Justice Act, Section 14. Section 14. She knew Section 14. She had helped draft Section 14 in a subcommittee 3 years ago, during the period when the ministry had believed that formal legal architecture could contain the informal fractures running beneath the surface of post-war magical society. Section 14 provided for emergency tribunals in cases where existing law was inadequate to address emerging threats to wizarding order. They had argued about the language of emerging threats for 2 days. She had wanted specificity. She had been overruled in favor of flexibility. She was beginning to understand why that memory had surfaced. "What network?" she said. Now he looked at her. The movement was slow and deliberate, and when his eyes met hers, they carried the expression of someone delivering news they have rehearsed and still find devastating in the delivery. A kind of controlled sadness, precise and contained, that was worse to witness than open grief would have been. "The Vesta Network," he said. The name registered in 3 distinct stages. First, recognition. The Vesta Network was not officially a network at all. It was a loose affiliation of post-war wizards and witches who had operated for the past 2 years in the contested space between legitimate reconstruction and something the ministry's intelligence division had been watching with increasing alarm. They moved artifacts. They moved information. They maintained connections between communities that the formal post-war settlement had deliberately separated on the grounds that separation was easier to manage than integration. Second, implication. If the tribunal was convened under Section 14, the ministry had decided that the Vesta network had crossed a line. The flexibility of emerging threat was being applied. Someone, several someones, were going to be called to testify. The evidence she had been compiling, the documentation she had been building in her capacity as a senior archivist in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the careful months-long accumulation of provenance records and movement logs and cross-referenced witness accounts. Third, him. Her eyes moved to his face with a new and terrible attention. The fire behind him, the amber light, the careful, controlled expression of a man who has put down something heavy and is waiting to see what happens next. "You're in it," she said. He did not confirm or deny. He looked at her with those pewter eyes and said nothing, and the nothing was its own answer, the particular silence of a person who will not lie but has not yet decided how much truth to offer. Draco. His name in her mouth felt different than it had 3 months ago. 3 months ago, it had been an exercise in conscious neutrality, the deliberate replacement of Malfoy with something that cost her a certain precision of feeling. Now, it was simply his name. Simply the word that meant him, specifically in this room, in this firelight. "Tell me what you are to them." He stood up. It was not an escape. He did not move toward the door. He moved to the window, which was his place of difficulty, she had learned, the physical location he occupied when he was thinking through something that resisted being thought. He stood with his back to her and his hands in his pockets and looked at the rain on the lane, his reflection superimposed on the dark glass as it always was, the indoor Draco and the wet street Draco occupying the same plane. "I'm not a member," he said. "I want that to be the first thing you hear." She waited. There is someone inside it. He stopped. The line of his shoulders held a tension that was visible even through the jacket, a bracing quality, as if against anticipated impact. "Someone I am responsible for in the way that—" Another stop. He tried again. "My mother spent 6 months after the war being assisted by people who asked nothing in return and wanted nothing from the Malfoy name except that it stay quiet. There were 3 of them. One is dead. One left the country. One is currently operating inside the Vesta network and is about to be named in a Section 14 tribunal." Hermione felt the information arrange itself into the shape she had been dreading without knowing what shape to dread. "You've been protecting them," she said. "I've been ensuring that the evidence trail doesn't lead directly to a person who helped my mother survive the immediate aftermath of the war." He turned from the window. His face was, if anything, more composed than it had been before, which was the expression he wore when something was costing him enormously. The composure was not coldness. It was the structure holding the heat in. "I have not falsified anything. I have not obstructed anything directly. I have managed the direction of certain lines of inquiry. You've been interfering with an active ministry investigation. I've been protecting a debt." The words were flat and final, without apology or performance. You can translate that into whatever legal category is most accurate. I'm not going to argue the characterization. She stood up, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic in the way she moved, just the physical necessity of not sitting still with this inside her. She walked to the fireplace and stood facing the embers with her arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the way of someone trying to hold their own ribs together against an internal pressure. The situation was clear, appallingly, precisely clear, in the way that only situations you have been half dreading can be clear. When they arrive in complete detail, because some part of you has been building the picture for weeks. Her documentation was the backbone of the prosecution's case. She had built it carefully, honestly, with the rigor she applied to everything she believed mattered. She had not known. She was certain in the part of herself that conducted ruthless self-assessment. She had genuinely not known that his interference was in the same network, the same timeline, the same architecture of evidence she had been constructing, or she had not allowed herself to know. That was the question she was standing in now, with the fire at her shins and his attention at her back. The difference between not knowing and not looking, between honest ignorance and the convenient kind. "How long have you known?" she said to the fire, that the tribunal would involve my documentation. A silence, long enough to be its own answer. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. She counted backward automatically. The last Thursday in March, when he had walked her to the door and said good night in the register, that was only for this room. The Thursday before that, when the conversation had gone longer than ever and ended with him sitting closer than he ever had, close enough that she had been aware of the specific warmth of him as a distinct thing from the fire's warmth. The Thursday before that, when he had looked at her with the expression she had filed under matters to him, and she had understood that the filing system was inadequate. 3 weeks of knowing, 3 weeks of continuing to come. "You kept meeting me," she said. "Yes. While you knew that I was building a case that will..." She stopped, restructured. "While you knew we were going to end up on opposite sides of this." "Yes." No elaboration, no defense. Just the word, carrying its full weight without attempting to distribute it. She turned around. He was standing where she had left him, between the window and the fire, in the middle of the room, which was not his preferred position. He was a perimeter person, walls and windows, the edges of spaces. Standing in the center of the room was, she understood, deliberate, an offering of exposure. He had placed himself where she could see all of him, removed the option of the window's reflection, the fire's sidelight. Just him, in the amber in the middle of the room, waiting for whatever she decided. "Say something," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady, because the rest of her was not. Her jaw was tight, her hands pressed into her own arms hard enough to feel the bone. Not a justification, not a defense, just say something real. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire made its small adjustments. The rain found a new angle against the glass. "I told you tonight," he said, "instead of waiting for you to find out through the tribunal notification. I told you first, before you had to read it in an official document with no context and no..." He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I came here tonight to tell you. That was the reason." She stared at him. "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to call it sufficient, but it is not nothing." Something in her chest performed a complicated movement, not softening, not breaking, but shifting, the way load-bearing structures shift when a new force is applied, redistributing weight before finding the next equilibrium. She had been building a certainty that this was betrayal, that the 3 weeks of knowing were 3 weeks of using their evenings to manage her, to keep her in proximity to him while he managed his position. She had been building it rapidly and efficiently, the way she built everything. And then he had said, "I came here tonight to tell you." And the certainty had found a crack. She did not say any of this. She stood in the firelight and looked at him standing in the middle of the room with his exposure offered and his defense withheld. And she thought about 3 months of Thursday evenings and the cold tea she had drunk anyway, and the notation system she had never mentioned, and the name that now meant him specifically and nothing else. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I need..." She pressed her lips together, tried again. "I don't know what happens to my documentation if I can't compromise what I've built. I can't compromise the case because of..." She gestured, slightly helplessly, at the space between them, which was inadequate, but was the only gesture available for 3 months of something she had never named. "I'm not asking you to," he said. And the stillness with which he said it, no flinch, no pressure, no lean toward a particular outcome, was the most precise thing he could have said, and they both knew it. Outside, the rain shifted to something heavier. It hit the glass with a new percussion, irregular, forceful, the sound of weather that has decided to stop being subtle. Inside, in the amber, in the warmth that still held despite everything, Hermione Granger stood 2 meters from Draco Malfoy and felt the specific vertiginous quality of a moment in which everything that comes next depends on a choice that has not yet been made. The fire settled into its embers with a sound like a held breath releasing. Neither of them moved. She moved first this time. Not toward him. Not yet. Not with that particular geometry available. But away from the fireplace, to the window he had vacated, because she needed the cold glass and the rain-dark street, and the distance from the amber warmth that had been making it difficult to think with the rigor this required. She pressed 2 fingertips to the window pane. The cold bit immediately, a clean and clarifying sensation, and she focused on it the way she had learned, in the war, to focus on physical sensation when the interior landscape became too loud. Below, Callaway Lane was empty. The rain had driven everyone indoors, and the street had the particular abandoned quality of a place that has surrendered to weather. Puddles reflecting the sodium lights in orange-tinted mirrors, the occasional tree bent in a direction that suggested the wind had a preference. A city holding its breath, or giving up on holding it. She had not yet decided which. Behind her, she could hear him. Not movement. He was still standing in the center of the room, she was nearly certain, but presence. The specific atmospheric pressure of him, which she had become attuned to without authorizing the attunement. The way the air in a room organized itself differently when he was in it. She had noticed this first in February and had spent 3 weeks trying to locate a rational explanation before abandoning the project. "The person you're protecting," she said to the glass. "Are they guilty?" A pause. Not evasion. She could feel the quality of it, the honest consideration. Of what the tribunal will charge them with, technically, yes. His voice came from slightly closer than she'd expected. He had moved, quietly, in the way he moved when he was not trying to be noticed moving. Of what the charge implies, the spirit of it, the intent the prosecution will argue. No. They moved artifacts because people needed them moved, not for profit or ideology. For the same reason, people kept a woman alive in the months after the war, when keeping her alive was not in anyone's political interest. She absorbed this, turned it, examined its edges. The tribunal won't make that distinction. "No," he said, "it won't. The law doesn't make that distinction. No, a beat. The law you helped write doesn't make that distinction." She closed her eyes briefly. The cold glass was still at her fingertips. She pressed harder, feeling the faint flecks of it, old and slightly warped, the bubbles and imperfections of pre-war manufacture caught in its surface like stopped breath. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "It wasn't meant to be." His voice was closer still. When she opened her eyes and looked at his reflection in the glass, he was perhaps 4 feet behind her, which was closer than he had ever stood in this room without an architecture of coincidence to attribute it to. no furniture to navigate, no fire to stand beside. Just the deliberate reduction of distance, acknowledged by both of them through its not being acknowledged. It was meant to be accurate. She turned. The 4 feet between them became immediately different in quality when she was facing him. It was not a large distance in any objective measurement of space, but it had weight and charge. The concentrated pull of proximity between 2 people who have been careful about proximity for long enough that its reduction registers in the body before the mind catches up. "You want me to feel responsible," she said. "I want you to feel accurate," he said. "There's a distinction. Don't." The word came out with more heat than she had intended, and she watched his expression shift. Not recoil. Draco Malfoy did not recoil, but a minute recalibration, an adjustment of attention. "Don't use my own argument structure against me. That's..." She stopped, pressed her fingers into her opposite sleeve cuff, straightening it, adjusting the fold at her wrist with unnecessary precision. "That's not a conversation. That's a technique." "All right." He said it without resentment. "You're right." The concessions surprised her, as his concessions always did. Not because they were rare, but because they were never tactical. He did not concede to manage her. He conceded when he was wrong, specifically and only then. And the precision of it was harder to receive than stubbornness would have been. "I'm angry," she said, because it was accurate, and she had promised herself sometime in February that accuracy was the only thing she would insist on in this room. Not comfort, not strategy, accuracy. "I know. I built that case for 8 months. 8 months of documentation, of cross-referencing, of source verification, of..." She stopped. The anger was moving through her in the way it always did, not like fire, but like current, electric and directional, looking for ground. "I believed in it. I believe in what it's trying to do, even if the specific application is..." She caught herself. "I believe in the principle of it." "I know you do." His voice had dropped into a register she associated with this room specifically, lower than his public voice, quieter. The voice for things that were true. "I've never doubted that." "Then how..." She made a gesture, sharp and insufficient. "How did you let 3 months happen while you knew that we were... while you knew..." "Because it was 3 months." The words came out with a force she hadn't anticipated, not loud, but dense, as if they had been compressed a long time before release. "Because I came to that first ministry meeting with every expectation of a working relationship conducted at the appropriate distance, and instead found..." He stopped. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle working briefly before he controlled it. "I found this. Whatever this is. I found that I was looking forward to Thursdays in a way that had nothing to do with artifact legislation. And I found that when I looked at you across that table, I was thinking about things that were not in any file. And I found that it was already too late to be sensible about it by the time I had the information about the tribunal." The room was very still. Even the rain seemed to have adjusted its volume, pulling back slightly, as if extending the courtesy of space. Hermione stood with her sleeve cuff perfectly straight and looked at him, at the deliberate tension of his hands at his sides, the slight elevation of his chest that indicated a breathing rate he was managing, the expression on his face that was more exposed than she had ever seen it, stripped of the several layers of composure he usually maintained as a matter of structural necessity. She thought he just said something real. She thought, I asked him to, and he did. The anger was still present. It had not resolved or dissolved. It was a valid anger, grounded in real grievance, and she was not the kind of person who released valid things simply because something softer presented itself alongside them. But beneath it, or beside it, running parallel in the way that two incompatible truths sometimes run parallel without cancelling each other. Beneath it was the thing she had been not naming for 3 months, and it was pressing now against the boundary she had maintained around it with the specific insistence of things that have grown too large for their container. You should have told me sooner, she said. Yes. 3 weeks of knowing that's a choice I should have been part of. Yes. No qualification. No but. Just the word and the weight it carried. It changes things. She was watching him carefully. You understand that. I can't. Whatever I decide about the case, about my documentation, about what I do with what you've just told me, none of those decisions can look like they were influenced by... Again, the insufficient gesture at the space between them. I'm not asking you to alter your testimony. Each word placed precisely with the care of a man who has thought about this sentence for 3 weeks. I'm not asking you to do anything with the case. I came tonight to tell you before the official notification arrived, because you deserve to hear it from me, and because... A pause, brief, but with depth. Because I didn't want to lose what this is over an omission, even if telling you risks it just the same. She stared at him. You came tonight, she said slowly, working through it, knowing that telling me might mean I don't come back. Yes. And you told me anyway. Yes. The logic of it moved through her with a quiet, devastating clarity. He had come tonight not to manage her, not to keep her close through strategic withholding, but to tell her the truth at the risk of the thing he was. She could see it now, had perhaps been able to see it for weeks, the thing he was most reluctant to lose. He had chosen accuracy over self-protection, which was the only language she had told him she would trust, and he had spoken it without being entirely certain she would receive it. This was, she recognized with a bone-deep and inconvenient certainty, precisely the kind of thing that made her angry and undone in equal and simultaneous measure. I hate this, she said, not at him. Somewhere between them, the shape of the situation, the elegant and terrible trap of having genuine feeling for a person in the specific direction of a genuine conflict. I hate that I can't. I hate that the case is real and you are real, and that those two things are currently occupying the same... Hermione. Her name again. She felt it the same way she always felt it, the specific shape of it in his register, the sound of something long considered finally spoken. I know, he said. I know it's both. I'm not asking you to resolve it tonight. Then what are you asking? He looked at her. The fire had died back further, and the lamp was doing most of the work now, and in its steady amber he looked. Not soft. Draco Malfoy did not look soft. That was not available in his range. But open. Open in the way of a window that has been shut a long time and has finally been raised, not because the weather outside is good, but because the interior air has become necessary to exchange. I'm asking you to stay, he said. Tonight. Just Tonight, before whatever tomorrow makes of both of us. A pause. Something moved across his face, a complex transit, grief and something warmer, and something that did not have a single name. Let me have one evening where we're not the tribunal and the documentation and the opposing sides of a line neither of us drew. Just one evening that's only this. The word "this" landed between them with the full weight of 3 months behind it. She felt it in her chest, in her palms, the specific awareness of the distance between them that was 4 feet and had been 4 feet for 10 minutes now, and had been, in its way, the most charged 4 feet she had ever stood across. Her cuff was already perfectly straight. She straightened it anyway, the gesture involuntary, her fingers pressing the fold flat with unnecessary force, and she recognized it for what it was. The body doing something small and controlled because the rest of it was not small and not controlled. And the management of that required an outlet of some kind. "You understand," she said, "that staying tonight doesn't resolve anything. I know that tomorrow is still tomorrow. I know that I still have to decide what I do, about the case, about everything. I know." His voice was very quiet. "I'm not asking for tomorrow. I'm asking for tonight." She looked at him, standing in the middle of the room he had chosen for its neutrality, and which had become, over 3 months, anything but. This room that smelled of old timber and beeswax, and the specific mineral trace of chalk, that had a fire with its own character, and a window with warped glass, and a chair that had become hers, and a loose board on the landing she had never mentioned. She looked at him, and she thought about 8 months of documentation and the principles she believed in, and the anger that was real, and the other thing that was also real. And she thought about the loose board, and the notation system, and the poetry collection, and the careful, unhurried narrowing of distance across 3 months of Thursday evenings. She thought, "I am going to regret one of 2 things." She thought, "I would rather regret staying." "Make more tea," she said. He blinked, a single, fractional disruption of his composure, something almost surprised, carefully recovered. Then the corner of his mouth shifted, not a smile precisely, the indication of one. The shadow cast by a smile occurring somewhere just below the surface. He moved to the small table. She heard the clink of the pot, the sound of water, the particular domestic choreography of a simple task performed with care. She turned back to the window. Below, Callaway Lane still gleamed with rain. The puddles still held their orange reflections. The bent trees still leaned in the wind's preferred direction. She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass one last time, then let her hand fall. Behind her, the lamp burned steady. The fire breathed in its embers. The room held them both in its amber, and outside the world arranged itself into tomorrow's shape, patient and inevitable. And inside, there was the sound of tea being made, and the specific, fragile warmth of a choice that had just been made to stay. The tea was different this time. She noticed it without meaning to. A different blend, something darker than the bergamot of earlier, with a faint smokiness that reminded her of the Hogwarts library in winter, of stone walls and candle wax, and the particular quality of silence that exists only in places where thinking has been the primary occupation for centuries. She wrapped both hands around the cup and did not comment on it, and he did not explain it, and the small unspoken recognition of the change existed between them as its own quiet form of communication. He had taken his usual place on the settle. She had not returned to her chair. Instead, she had moved, without entirely deciding to move, the way water moves toward a gradient without deliberating, to the other end of the same settle, so that they were sitting at opposite ends of a shared piece of furniture for the first time in 3 months of evenings. The distance between them was perhaps 2 feet. It was not a large distance. It was considerably smaller than anything they had maintained before. Neither of them remarked on it. The fire had been replenished. She had not seen him do it, had been at the window, but he had done it without being asked, without announcing it in the manner of his small provisions. And it was burning with a renewed amber intensity that made the room feel sealed against the weather, a separate atmosphere entirely, hermetic and warm. She thought about what she had just agreed to. Stay. Tonight. Just tonight. It was not, she told herself, a capitulation. She was not abandoning the case, not softening her position on the tribunal, not allowing feeling to colonize the space that principle occupied. She was simply acknowledging that she was a person as well as a function, and that the person in question had been in this room for 3 months, becoming something she had not planned on becoming, and that one evening, one specific, bracketed, amber-lit evening before the machinery of tomorrow engaged, was not the same as surrender. This was what she told herself. The more honest version was that she had looked at him standing in the center of the room with his composure held at cost and his exposure offered without guarantee. And she had felt something move in her chest that was neither anger nor logic, nor anything she had a useful clinical term for. And she had understood that staying was not a choice so much as an acknowledgement of what was already true. She was here. She had been coming here for 3 months. The pretense of professional rationale had dissolved somewhere in February, and she had continued to come anyway, with her cold tea and her arguments and the secret of the loose board on the landing that was hers and hers alone. She was already staying. She was simply, now, admitting it. They did not talk about the tribunal. This required, initially, a kind of active navigation. She was aware of it at the edges of the conversation, the large, dark shape of it, and she suspected he was aware of it also. But by some unspoken and mutual agreement, they moved around it the way you move around furniture in a familiar room in the dark, without needing to name each piece. They knew where the edges were. They did not walk into them. Instead, he told her about the book. She had waited for weeks for this, had seen the slim, battered volume on the desk at every visit, had noted its position shifting slightly each time, handled, returned, the spine worn at the top where fingers had opened it repeatedly in the same plate. She had not asked. She was learning, in this room, the value of not asking, of creating the conditions in which things could be offered rather than extracted. Tonight, perhaps because the evening had already required so much of the interior, he simply reached across and picked it up and turned it in his hands. "My mother had an interest in Muggle literature," he said. Not openly. There were things she kept private in the house, things that existed in a space between what was required of her and what she actually was. He turned the book over. The cover was a deep green, the title embossed in faded gold, The Collected Poems of Edward Thomas. She kept this in a box with letters and 2 photographs that I wasn't supposed to know existed. I found it when I was 11, just before Hogwarts. I didn't read it then. I wasn't the kind of child who would have known what to do with it. "And now?" she said. He opened the book. Somewhere near the middle, the worn place, and she could see the page without reading it from where she sat, the particular texture of old paper, the narrow columns of verse, a pencil mark in the margin that was his mother's, or his own, or both. "Now I think about the fact that she kept it," he said. "More than what's in it, though that—" He stopped, a decision being made. There's a poem about roads, about the moment before a choice is made, the standing at a junction, and how that moment becomes the thing you carry more than the road you eventually take. He closed the book, set it back on the desk beside the cufflinks, precisely with the care of things returned to their proper place. I think about that when I'm in rooms like this one, where the junction hasn't happened yet. She looked at him. "Thomas," she said, "the poem about roads is usually misread as being about regret. People assume the speaker regrets the choice, but he doesn't. He's already decided he'll tell himself he regrets it. It's a poem about the story we build around our choices, not about the choices themselves." His eyes came to her face. That quality of attention again. The arrested, specific quality of someone hearing something that lands with accuracy. "You know it," he said. "My father taught English literature before he retired. I grew up with Thomas and Owen and Rossetti." She looked at her tea, at the dark surface of it reflecting the lamplight in a small, warm oval. "I always thought the poem was about the necessity of narrative, that we need a story for our choices, even when the choice was the only choice available." "Was staying tonight the only choice available?" he said. She looked up. He was watching her with the careful steadiness that she had come to understand as the outward form of something far less steady beneath. "No," she said honestly. "I could have left. I could leave now." She held his gaze. But the choices that are available to us are not always equally true. Something shifted in his expression. That complex transit again. The movement of more than one thing across a face, trying to hold them all in careful arrangement. "What does that mean?" he said. Not challenging, genuine. "It means," she said slowly, "that I could construct a version of tonight in which leaving is the correct and principled action. I'm very good at constructing arguments. I could have one built in 6 minutes that would satisfy most reasonable standards of internal logic." She paused. The fire made its small adjustment. "But it wouldn't be true. And I decided some time ago that this room is for accurate things." He was very still. "Hermione," he said. "Her name in that register, the one she would not be able to unhear." "Don't," she said, but gently, very gently. "Say something careful. Not right now." He closed his mouth, opened it, closed it again. What he did instead was move. Not dramatically. Nothing between them had ever been dramatic in the broad theatrical sense, because they were both people whose most significant gestures were the small ones, the chosen ones, the ones that cost something precisely because of their restraint. He simply shifted his position on the settle, a single, deliberate movement that reduced the 2 feet between them to something closer to one. She did not move away. The gap between them held a pressure now, a stillness with density the atmospheric quality of the moment before weather breaks. Not threatening, but charged, the air itself seeming to lean in a direction. She could feel the specific warmth of him as a distinct register from the fire's warmth. She had noticed this before, from further away. From here, it was unmistakable. The warmth of a particular person, carrying the specific molecular signature of wood smoke and something cleaner, a trace of some cold-weather herb she had never identified, and beneath it the simple human warmth that was his and no one else's. She kept her eyes on the fire. "I've been afraid," she said, "of what this changes." "What does it change?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved seriousness, and because it was the kind of question that, in this room, could not be given the convenient answer. "Everything I know how to be," she said finally, "is organized around certainty, around knowing what's right and doing it regardless of what it costs. That's not, I don't say that with pride, it's simply how I'm constructed. And you." She stopped, began again. "You make the certainties complicated. You always have. Even when I was 17 and you were everything I thought you were. Even then, there were moments when the certainty flickered." She felt the heat in her face and said nothing about it. "I don't do well with flickering." "I know," he said. His voice was very close. Not because he had moved again, she would have felt it, but because the distance was simply small enough, now that his voice required no projection, existed at the particular intimacy of a register meant only for the immediate space. You do something when the certainty flickers. You straighten your cuff, or you find a book, or you build an argument you don't entirely believe. A pause so slight it was almost breath. "I've been watching you manage it for 3 months." Her hands were in her lap. She looked down at them, the teacup set aside, her fingers resting open against her own knees, and she thought about how visible she apparently was to him, how thoroughly she had been read by a person she had simultaneously been reading, 2 people conducting parallel acts of careful attention and calling them something less than what they were. "That should frighten me," she said. "Does it?" She turned her head. He was closer than she had registered. Not touching, the careful inch of air between his shoulder and her still intact, but close enough that she could see the texture of his jaw, the faint evidence of a long day, the particular quality of his eyes at this proximity, which was not pewter at this distance, but something warmer, more complex, the layered grey of old mirrors that show you your own reflection slightly altered. "No," she said. He did not move. The inch of air remained. But something in the quality of his stillness changed, a releasing, somewhere in the architecture of his posture, like a cable under tension that has been permitted, finally, a fraction of slack. "There are things I should say," he said, his eyes on hers, "that I haven't said, that I have. There are things I have managed very carefully not to say, because the room for them seemed wrong, or the time seemed wrong, or I was waiting for some moment that felt less." He exhaled, brief, controlled, less like standing at Thomas's junction. "Then don't wait," she said. The words were barely above the fire's register. She had not planned them. They arrived fully formed from somewhere below the level at which she planned things, from the place where the accurate things lived before she organized them into language. His hand moved. Slowly, the slowness that characterized everything he did in this room, the patience that she had learned, was not absence of feeling, but its most precise expression. His hand moved from where it had been resting on his knee and came to rest on the settle between them, not touching her, adjacent. His fingers against the old fabric, close enough that she could feel, through some mechanism she could not explain and did not try to, the warmth of his hand through the inch of air that remained. She looked at his hand, the long fingers, the silver ring on his right hand that she had noticed in January and filed in the category of specific, unexplained details. The faint tension in the tendons, the care of the gesture, the weight of the choice within it. She turned her own hand over. It was a small movement, the rotation of a wrist. Her palm upward on the settle, open beside his, not quite touching, a quarter-inch perhaps of charged and deliberate space. They sat like that for a moment that had the quality of held breath, of a flame in still air before anyone moves. Outside, the rain made its patient argument against the glass. Inside, the fire burned with its amber character, and the lamp held its steady light, and the room kept them both in its warmth. And the junction they were standing at had the particular quality of junctions that are not, in the end, between two different roads, but between moving and standing still. His little finger moved. The faintest possible contact, the side of his smallest finger against the side of hers, less than a touch, the suggestion of one, the barest possible point of connection between two people who had been, for 3 months, conducting the most elaborate and careful and mutually devastating approach toward exactly this. She did not move away. The fire shifted. Above the building, the rain continued, indifferent and relentless, the way grief is, the way certain truths are. Inside, in the amber, something that had been almost true for 3 months became, in the space of a fingertip's width, simply true. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing, just then, that language could do that the silence was not already doing better. She did not sleep. She had not expected to. Sleep required a surrender of attention she was not capable of tonight, not with his hand a half-inch from hers on the settle, and the fire burning down to its patient embers, and the rain conducting its long argument with the glass. She sat in the amber and breathed, and was, for once in her adult life, not thinking forward. This was unusual enough to be worth noting. Hermione Granger's mind was, under ordinary circumstances, oriented primarily toward the next thing, the next argument, the next problem, the next necessary action. It was a quality she had cultivated from childhood and refined through war, and found, afterward, to be both her most reliable asset, and the thing that made certain rooms feel very empty at 3 a.m. The inability to simply be in a moment without cataloguing its implications for the moments that followed. But here, now, with his finger's edge against hers, and the warmth of the room wrapped around both of them, and the sound of the rain doing the work that silence sometimes cannot. Here, the forward orientation had stilled. She was in this moment only. In the specific weight of it, the specific warmth, the specific quality of a contact so small it should have been insignificant, and was instead the most significant thing she had felt in longer than she was prepared to measure. She thought, this is what people mean when they say present. She thought, I have spent so much of my life somewhere else. At some point, She could not have said when the evening had dissolved the usual markers of time. He had spoken again. Not about the tribunal, not about tomorrow. He had told her about the first months after the war, which was not a subject he had ever approached before, and she had understood, from the care with which he chose each word, that he was telling her something he had not told anyone. His father had been imprisoned within the month. His mother had stayed at the manor, which was no longer entirely theirs in any meaningful sense. Visited by ministry officials with clipboards and dispassionate expressions, inventoried, assessed, the artifacts catalogued by a junior department she had recognized, with a small internal lurch as the precursor to the one she now worked within. Draco had been 18 and had walked through rooms that had always been enormous and found them suddenly oppressively larger, emptied of everything that had given the enormity its particular flavor, and had understood for the first time that a house and a home are entirely different propositions. "There was a morning," he said, to the fire rather than to her, "in October, 3 months after. I came downstairs, and my mother was in the garden, not doing anything, just standing in the garden, in the frost, looking at something I couldn't see from the window." He paused. She had been not well in those months, not in any way I could name or address or fix, just present in the way of someone who is present and elsewhere simultaneously. Another pause, longer. I watched her for a while from the window. And then she did something I hadn't seen her do I couldn't remember when I'd last seen it. She bent down and picked something up from the garden, a stone or a piece of bark, something small and ordinary, and she held it in her hand and looked at it for a long time. His voice was very quiet, completely controlled, which was how she knew. And I thought, if she can find something worth holding in that garden, I can find something worth doing with the day. That was as far as I could think in those months. One day, and something worth doing with it. She listened without speaking. This was a skill she had developed in this room, the specific skill of receiving without immediately processing aloud, without the reflexive movement toward response that was her natural mode. She had learned that he offered things more completely when she did not reach for them before they had finished arriving. "The woman in the Vesta network," she said, when she was certain he had finished, "was one of the people who helped her. Her name is Mirella." He said it quietly, the first time he had named her. A small act of trust, she understood, the movement from abstraction to person. She arrived in November of that year with no introduction, except a note from someone I've never identified. She came twice a week for 4 months. She brought my mother back by some means I never fully understood, and am not sure was entirely within the boundaries of approved magic. And I have never asked, because some things you don't audit. Hermione looked at the side of his face, the firelight finding his cheekbone, the line of his jaw, the controlled expression that was not coldness. "I understand," she said. He looked at her, searching briefly for the sincerity in it. "I know you do," he said, and then, after a moment, "That's the difficulty." She had not asked him to explain what he meant. She had heard it clearly enough, that her understanding was not a comfort but a complication, that the fact of her being someone who could comprehend his reasons was precisely what made the situation between them so loaded, so unresolvable by the usual methods. If she had been merely the opposition, a ministry official with documentation and no interior life visible to him, the thing could have been navigated with the familiar tools of professional conflict. But she was not that. She had become, at some point in the amber of this room, someone he could tell about October gardens and wordless maternal grief, and that was an entirely different kind of problem. She thought about what it meant to be someone's problem. In the past, the concept had been straightforwardly negative. She had worked most of her life to be no one's inconvenience, no one's complication, the person who resolved things rather than the thing requiring resolution. In this room, being his complication felt less like a failure and more like an indication of depth. You did not become complicated for people who did not matter. The fire had dropped to a level that was more warmth than light, and she had not replenished it, and he had not either. And this too felt like an agreement. Let the light decrease. Let the evening become less legible. Let the darkness at the room's edges move inward without intervention. In the lowered light, the amber concentrated rather than dissipated, gathered itself into a smaller and more intimate radius that included the settle and both of them and not much else. She became aware that her head had moved. Not dramatically. She had not lurched toward him. Nothing about this evening had lurched. Every movement had been characterized by the unhurried inevitability of tides. But the angle of her head had shifted over the past hour, incrementally, the way plants orient toward light without appearing to move, until she was no longer looking at the fire, but at the middle distance. And the middle distance was the line of his shoulder, and her head was tilted in the particular direction of someone who is approximately 4 inches from resting it against something. She straightened, very slightly, not retreating, simply readjusting, the way you adjust your grip on something you want to hold correctly rather than simply hold. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You can," he said. 2 words, barely voiced. She felt them more in the chest than the ear. She did not pretend not to understand. That kind of pretense was not available in this room. "I know," she said. She let her head settle against his shoulder. The quality of the stillness that followed was unlike any other stillness she had experienced. Not the stillness of an empty room, or the forced stillness of waiting, or the uneasy stillness of a conversation that has stalled. This was the stillness of something having arrived, the particular and profound quiet of emotion completed, a thing finally at rest after a long and effortful journey. His shoulder was solid. That was the first and most immediate impression. Not comfort, not warmth, though both were present, but solidity, the specific reassurance of something that is unambiguously there. She was aware of the fabric of his jacket, the slight texture of it, and beneath that the warmth of him, and beneath that the faint and even rhythm of his breathing, which she could feel rather than hear at this proximity. His breathing had been, she noticed, slightly elevated before she moved. It was not elevated now. She thought, with a clarity that should have been unsettling, but was instead just true. He has been waiting for this as long as I have. The hand that was not beside hers on the settle, that had not moved from its position of almost contact, still maintaining the 1/4 inch of charged air between their fingers, moved. Slowly. It came to rest on the settle behind her, not around her, Nothing so declared as that, but behind, the arm as a kind of surrounding without enclosure, present and available without insisting on itself. She exhaled. The exhalation was longer than usual, deeper, the breath of someone releasing a held position. She had not known she was holding it. She had been holding it, she suspected, for significantly longer than this evening. "I've been," she said, to the fire and the amber and the close dark, "very stupid about this." She felt, rather than heard the response, a minute movement of his chest that was not quite a sound, something between a breath and a word that resolved into neither. "Not stupid," he said, eventually. The word was considered, chosen. "Careful. There's a difference. A beat. You're always careful, even when being careful costs you things." "What has it cost me?" The question was genuine. She felt him consider it, felt it in the slight shift of his shoulder beneath her head, the fractional change in his breathing, the quality of the pause that followed. "February," he said. "March, most of April." She understood. The months that had been spent approaching rather than arriving. The evenings that had ended with space between them that could have been less. The conversations that had gone to the edge of something and then turned back with such precision that only she, who had orchestrated the turning, knew how close they had come. "You didn't push," she said. "No. You could have." "I know." His voice was very quiet. "You needed to arrive at it yourself. Anything else would have been..." He stopped. "Anything else would have been the wrong kind of persuasion, and whatever this is, I don't want it built on persuasion." She closed her eyes. The fire made its small sound. The rain had shifted again, lighter now or further away, the city changing its weather without consulting anyone. She could feel, through the warped old glass of the nearby window, the faint osmosis of the outside cold. But it reached her as a distant thing, a rumour of temperature, unable to penetrate the specific warmth of where she was. His fingers moved. On the settle, the almost contact resolved. His hand covered hers, fully, his palm against the back of her hand, his fingers settling between hers with the careful, deliberate quality of everything he had ever done in this room. Not a grip, a covering, a warmth placed over another warmth. She turned her hand over and held his. The fire burned. The lamp stood steady. Outside, Callaway Lane lay rain-wet and empty under its sodium lights. She thought about the months, the minutes. The quarter inches of air accumulated and slowly, carefully reduced. The book of poetry on the desk with its worn spine and its pencil mark. The cufflinks beside it, coiled and still. The loose board on the third step that she had never mentioned. She thought, tomorrow is still coming. She thought, but it is not here yet. She laced her fingers through his, and in the amber and the warmth and the particular sacred quiet of the room on Callaway Lane, she simply breathed, and he breathed, and the night held them both in its dark and careful hands. Somewhere in the next hour, without deciding to, she slept. She woke to the smell of coffee, not the tea she had expected, not the bergamot or the smoky darkness of the second pot, but coffee, real and strong, the kind that announced itself before you were fully conscious, that reached through the layers of sleep with a specificity that meant someone had made a decision, had chosen this particular thing for this particular morning. She was still on the settle. A blanket had appeared. She had no memory of it, which meant he had placed it over her at some point in the night with the same silent provision that characterized all his care, the same grammar of things done without announcement. It was dark wool, warm, slightly heavy, and it smelled of the room, beeswax and timber, and the particular mineral note that lived in the walls. She did not open her eyes immediately. There was a moment, upon waking in unfamiliar circumstances, that existed before orientation, before the mind reassembled the architecture of where and how and why, a moment of pure, unlocated consciousness that carried no weight because it carried no context. She had learned in the war to move through this moment quickly, to arm herself with awareness before it could arm her with confusion. This morning, she stayed in it. She stayed because she knew, at some level below articulation, that the moment she opened her eyes, the morning would begin, and the morning would bring with it everything she had agreed last night to defer, not to escape. She had not been naive about the terms of stay until morning. She had understood, when she let her head fall against his shoulder, that morning was the boundary, not a solution. But there was a difference between knowing the boundary existed and standing at it. She was not ready to stand at it, not yet. She gave herself 60 seconds, counted them approximately in the darkness behind her closed eyes, with the smell of coffee and the warmth of the blanket and the sound of him. Somewhere nearby, the quiet movement of a person who is being careful not to wake someone they do not want to wake. The particular consideration of it. She memorized it, briefly and deliberately, the way you memorize the last page of a book you know you will not be able to reread. Then she opened her eyes. The room had changed its character with the hour. The fire was newly built. He had been up for some time then, long enough to let the night's embers die and rebuild from the grate, because the fire burning now was a morning fire, higher and more purposeful than the evening's slow amber, its light a different quality, cleaner and less forgiving. The lamp had been extinguished. The room was running on firelight, and the grey, grudging illumination beginning to seep through the warped window glass, the particular early light of a city not yet committed to the day, its colour the blue-grey of old pewter, of pigeons, of the hour before anyone has to be anything in particular. Draco was at the writing desk. He had not heard her wake, or he had and was allowing her the courtesy of the pretense, which amounted to the same thing. He was sitting with his back partly to her, one elbow on the desk, his head bent over something. Not the book of poetry. She could see that on the corner of the desk, closed, the green cover catching the firelight. Something he was writing. His handwriting, she had observed over months of shared documents, was precise and slightly angular, entirely legible, the penmanship of someone who had been trained to it and had kept the training, but shed the ornamentation. She could not read what he was writing from here. She did not try. He was still in yesterday's clothes. The charcoal jacket had been removed at some point and hung over the back of the desk chair, and he was in his shirt, the collar still open, the sleeves turned back to mid-forearm in the way of someone who has been awake for hours in a warm room. His hair was entirely without its daytime order now, having surrendered to the night, and the firelight caught the silver blonde of it and made it briefly, uncharacteristically soft. She watched him write. There was something in it that she wanted to hold carefully, not to analyze, not to categorize, just to hold. The specific domestic reality of a person in an unguarded moment. She had known him in his committee version, in his composed-for-the-room version, in the layered and careful version he wore as his public self. She had glimpsed, over 3 months, the person beneath those versions. But this, the back of his head and the open collar and the pen moving across paper at 6 in the morning, this was something else. This was the person he was when he believed himself unobserved. And it was, she thought, with the accuracy she had promised this room, the most intimate thing she had seen. She sat up slowly. The blanket fell from her shoulders, and she caught it and folded it across her lap, and the movement was quiet, but not quiet enough. He stilled, turned. Their eyes met across the room, in the blue-grey morning light, with the fire between them and the sound of the rain. Still raining, or raining again, she could not tell. The night had blurred its intervals against the glass. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back. In the morning light, without the amber's softening influence, she could see him more clearly, which meant she could see what the night had done to his face. There were shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there yesterday, the evidence of hours awake in the particular way of someone whose thoughts do not allow sleep, and something in his expression that was both more open and more careful than his usual range, the look of a person who has arrived at a difficult morning and decided to meet it honestly. "Coffee," he said. His voice carried the texture of the early hour, slightly lower, the vocal equivalent of the room's blue-grey light. "Yes," she said. "Please." He rose. She watched him move to the small table. He had acquired, at some point in the night, a coffee press and 2 cups that had not been there before, which meant he had left the building and returned, had gone out into the pre-dawn city for the specific purpose of making this possible, had done this while she slept and said nothing about it. She thought about what that meant, filed it in no category, simply let it be what it was. He brought her the cup and did not return to the desk, but sat as he had last night, on the settle. At the opposite end, the original distance restored, 2 feet of morning air between them. She understood this too. Last night's closeness was last night's. The morning required its own negotiation. She held the cup. The heat of it was different from the tea's heat, more immediate, more insistent. She drank without speaking, and he sat with his own cup, and for a few minutes the room held them in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile. The specific silence of 2 people who are aware that a significant conversation is approaching and are taking a last quiet breath before it. The grey light at the window had acquired a faint blue tinge. The city was committing, gradually, to the day. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited. He was very good at waiting, in the specific way of someone who has disciplined himself to it because his instinct is otherwise. She had worked this out in February, and it had not stopped being true. "About Mirella," she said. Something shifted in his posture, barely perceptible, a fractional adjustment of stillness. She continued before it could become something more guarded. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about November and your mother, and what it means to owe someone a debt that the law can't account for." She wrapped both hands around the cup. The law I helped write can't account for it. I know that. I knew it when I was writing it, and I made the calculation that the framework required breadth, and that breadth would create exceptions, and that exceptions were. I told myself they were the necessary cost of a functional system. She paused. I've been comfortable with that calculation for 3 years. And now, he said, quiet, no pressure behind it. And now I know the name of one of the exceptions. She looked at the fire. That changes the texture of the calculation, not the principle. I still believe in what the system is trying to do, but the texture. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about whether there's a way to document the context, the mitigating circumstances, not to remove Mirella from the process, but to ensure the process has the full picture before it decides. She heard him breathe. That's not compromising the case, she said. That's making the case more accurate, which is what the case is supposed to be. He was looking at her. She could feel it, the quality of his attention, without turning her head. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. I want to be precise about this. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. She turned her head, met his eyes. In the morning light, they were not pewter. There was something lighter, the grey of a sky committing to clearing, the colour of a day that had not yet decided its weather. You made a point last night of not asking me for anything I wasn't prepared to give. I'm aware of it. A pause. I'm choosing to give this because it's accurate and because... She stopped, began again, because the beginning was wrong, too hedged. Because I have spent 3 months in this room arriving at the understanding that some things are true regardless of whether they're convenient, and the context around Mirella is true, and I am someone who cannot document a half-truth when the full truth is available. He said nothing for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice had changed register, not lower, but quieter, and the quiet was a different kind. Hermione, he said. She waited. There are things I have managed not to say, he said, that I spoke of last night and that I did not, in the end, say. A pause. His jaw shifted briefly, the contained kind. I should like to say them now, before the morning becomes what the morning is going to become. She set down her cup. She turned to face him properly, drawing one knee up onto the settle, her body orienting toward him with the full attention she had spent 3 months partially withholding. She gave it completely now, all of it, every available quality of her attention. Then say them, she said. He looked at her across the 2 feet of morning air. The fire burned behind him, and the grey-blue light came through the warped glass, and outside, Callaway Lane was beginning its tentative resumption. A door somewhere, footsteps at a distance, the city remembering how to be a city. I came to that first ministry meeting, he said, expecting to manage a professional obligation at the appropriate distance from a person I had a complicated history with. I had prepared for the distance. I was entirely unprepared for the absence of it. He paused. I was unprepared for you, specifically. Not Granger the ministry official, not Granger the war hero, not any of the versions that had a designated space in the way I'd arranged things. You, the person who drinks cold tea without commenting on it, and has a notation system I developed independently, and looks at the spines of books before she decides whether to trust the room. His voice was steady. The steadiness was costing him. She had learned how to read that. I didn't know what to do with that person, so I came back the following Thursday and the one after that, and eventually I stopped pretending to myself that I was coming for the artifact legislation. She was very still. "I am not," he said, "a person who has had this." He made the gesture she recognized, the slightly insufficient gesture at the space between them. "Not this version of it. I have had the convenient kind, and the strategic kind, and the kind that lasted until it was inconvenient, and then resolved neatly. I have not had the kind that makes the week's shape different because of one evening in it." His eyes did not leave hers. "I have not had the kind that makes me go out at 5 in the morning for coffee because I wanted the morning to be something other than just morning." She felt something move through her from sternum to throat, a warmth that was not the fire's warmth, not the coffee's, something interior and sourceless. "You went out at 5 in the morning," she said. "The building's owner has a kitchen. He was awake. He didn't ask questions." A beat. He never asks questions. It's one of his better qualities. She looked at him. The morning light, the open collar, the shadows beneath his eyes from a night spent thinking rather than sleeping. The pen on the desk beside the book of poetry and the paired cufflinks. The careful, deliberate, enormously patient person who had gone out at 5 in the morning into the rain-wet city because he wanted her to wake to something warm. "Draco?" she said. He waited, braced, she thought, not visibly, but in the interior way, the place where he held things that were not available for external observation. "I am going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it without immediately building a counter-argument, because I know that's your instinct when something threatens the arrangement of things." "All right," he said, careful, watching her. "I'm in love with you." The words arrived fully formed, without preamble or revision, as accurate things sometimes do. "I have been, I think, since sometime in March, and I have been extraordinarily unwilling to examine it directly because it did not fit the framework I had constructed for what this was. But I am telling you now because the morning is coming, and I would rather you know before it arrives than after." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he crossed the 2 feet between them. Not slowly, not with the careful, incremental patience of every previous approach. He crossed it directly, the way a person moves when patience has reached its outermost boundary, and what lies beyond it is simply truth. And he took her face between his hands, and he kissed her. It was not the tentative kiss of people who have been uncertain. It was the kiss of people who have been certain for months and have been waiting with extraordinary discipline for the moment when certainty could be acted upon, warm and deliberate and complete, his hands steady at her jaw, her hands coming up to his wrists, not to stop him, but to hold him there, in the specific and absolute present of it. The fire burned. The morning light came through the warped glass and made the room its own particular colour. Outside, Callaway Lane was waking by degrees, indifferent and ordinary, the city resuming its familiar shape. Inside, in the warmth, they stayed precisely where they were. When they finally parted, not far, barely an inch, his forehead coming to rest against hers in the silence after. She could feel his breath against her face, unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. The controlled steadiness, finally, completely released. "I have been in love with you," he said, against the small space between them, "since February." She laughed. It came out softer than expected, warmer, not the laugh of something funny, but of something true, arriving with unexpected gentleness. "February," she said. "The notation system," he said. It was the notation system. She pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes, at this proximity, were entirely without their usual guarded quality. Open, fully, in the way of a window finally raised, not because the weather outside is good, but because the interior air needed exchange. She had thought this, once, about him, and here it was. The actual opened window, the actual exchanged air. "I never told you about the notation system," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw it in your margin, and I didn't say anything, and I thought about it for 2 weeks." She looked at him. She thought, February. She thought, all those Thursdays. She thought, we have been extraordinarily stupid in exactly the same direction. She kissed him again. This one was different. Less arrival, more dwelling, the specific warmth of two people who have just discovered they have been in the same place for longer than either knew and are choosing now to simply remain in it. Outside, the morning pressed its full weight against the warped glass. Inside, neither of them moved toward it. The morning came fully, as mornings do, without asking permission. The grey-blue light that had crept through the warped glass in tentative increments finally committed itself, flooding the room with the particular honesty of full daylight, the kind that shows the dust on the furniture and the wear on the upholstery and the specific imperfections of old things that lamplight had been generous enough to conceal. The fire was still burning, but its character had diminished against the competition of natural light, reduced from the room's primary source to a supplementary warmth, a habit rather than a necessity. Hermione noticed all of this from where she sat, which was where she had been for the past hour, her back against the arm of the settle, her legs drawn up, her shoulder against his. He had one arm around her, loosely, the weight of it both casual and deliberate, the kind of contact that has graduated past the careful and into the simply present. His chin rested at her temple occasionally when he turned his head. She was aware of it each time with a precision that she suspected would not diminish, even if it became the most ordinary thing in the world. She was thinking about tomorrow. She could not help it. The forward orientation had returned with the daylight, the mind reasserting its habitual direction. But it felt different than it had last night. The thinking was not anxious in the same way. It had the quality of someone standing at a window, looking out at weather that is approaching, who is also aware, with some certainty, that the room behind them is warm. The tribunal was still real. The documentation was still real. Mirella's situation was real. And the question of what Hermione would do with the contextual information she now possessed would require, in the very near future, a level of professional and ethical navigation that she did not underestimate. None of that had resolved itself in the amber of a single evening. But something else was also real, and it was sitting beside her with its arm around her shoulders and its chin at her temple. and it was of equal and, in certain moments, superior weight. She had spent her adult life believing that the personal and the principled occupied separate chambers, that the heart's inclinations and the mind's convictions were best managed by keeping them from interfering with each other's territory. It was an arrangement she had found functional. It was, she was beginning to understand, also incomplete. The kind of arrangement that holds under ordinary conditions and reveals its structural limitations precisely in the moments when the conditions are not ordinary at all. Last night had not resolved the conflict between what she felt and what she was required to do. But it had shown her something she had not previously known, that the conflict could be held simultaneously by a person who was both principled and in love, without either quality cancelling the other, that she could love him and do her work honestly, that he could protect Mirella and tell her the truth about it. The two people on what the world might call opposing sides could share a blanket and a cup of coffee in the blue-grey morning and still be, each of them, entirely themselves. This seemed obvious, stated plainly. It was, she recognized, not obvious at all when you were living inside it. "I need to ask you something," she said. He made a sound that indicated listening, not a word, just the specific quality of attention that she had learned to read as his most concentrated form. "After the tribunal," she said carefully. "Whatever happens with the process, with my documentation, with Mirella's situation, after all of that, when the machinery has done what it does." She paused, arranged it. "Is there a version of what this is that exists on the other side of it?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of hesitation. She knew his hesitation silences, had catalogued their particular texture, but the quiet of someone who is being honest about a question that deserves honesty. "That depends on you," he said. "I'm asking what you want." "I want," he said, with the controlled care of a person choosing words that have weight, "to have the conversation we did not have for 3 months. Not here, not in this room, but in the actual world, where our names are what they are, and the history is what it is, and the complications don't disappear simply because we would prefer them to." A pause. "I want to have that conversation, and to find out what we are when we're not protected by Thursday evenings, and amber light, and the particular rules of this room." She turned her head to look at him. "That's not a simple want," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." His eyes on hers, steady, the morning light making them the colour she still did not have entirely accurate language for. "But I've had the simple version of things. I know what that costs." She understood. The convenient kind, the strategic kind. He had said this at dawn, and she had filed it carefully, had understood it to mean that he was not offering her something easy or temporary, or designed to be resolved neatly when it became inconvenient. He was offering her something difficult and real, and built on 3 months of the most careful and honest approach she had ever been the subject of. She thought about the loose board on the landing, the notation system, the coffee at 5 in the morning. "I want that too," she said. Something in his face, the particular arrangement of it, changed. Not dramatically, just the faint and deeply significant release of tension she had come to associate with moments when Draco Malfoy allowed himself to believe that something good was actually happening. He did not wear relief in an obvious way. He wore it in the slight lowering of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible softening at the corners of his mouth, the way his eyes stayed on her face without the usual quality of bracing against what came next. "Good," he said, one word, quietly, with the full weight of a man who means it entirely. She rose from the settle eventually, because the morning required it, and went to retrieve her bag from beside the chair that was hers. That had been hers, she corrected herself, since February apparently, since before she had been willing to call it that. She straightened her robes, which had spent the night in a state of benign disorder and required some attention. She found her wand in its inner pocket. She attempted, with limited success, to address the state of her hair, which had surrendered entirely to the night. She was aware of him watching. Not the surveillance kind of watching, not assessment or evaluation. The kind of watching that is simply not wanting to look away. She had found, over 3 months, various reasons to look away at moments when she did not want to. She was attempting, as a deliberate practice, to stop finding them. She turned. He was still on the settle, his jacket retrieved from the desk chair and draped over his arm, his cufflinks in his opposite hand. She watched him fasten them, the small silver serpents, the precise, familiar motion of it. And he looked, in the full morning light, like someone who had not slept and did not regret it, like someone who has spent a night on the right side of a choice. "The tribunal notification," she said. "When will it arrive formally?" "End of the week." "Then I have until end of the week to submit supplementary documentation." She held his gaze. "I'm going to document the context. Mirella's involvement with your mother, the nature of the debt, the non-ideological motivation. I'm going to do it as part of the formal record, through proper channels, so that it's a transparent addition to the existing documentation rather than an interference with it." She paused. "The tribunal will still proceed. The law doesn't exempt what Mirella did, but the law is required to consider mitigating circumstances if they're formally submitted, and I'm going to submit them." He stood. The movement brought him to his full height in the morning light, and he looked at her across the room with an expression she had not seen before. Not composed, not guarded, not carefully arranged. Simply open. The window fully raised. "Hermione," he said. "I know," she said. "It may not change the outcome significantly. The tribunal is... The mechanism has its own momentum, but it will change the record, and the record matters." She lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in the way of someone who has made a decision they are certain of. It matters because it's true. Everything else it does or doesn't do is secondary to that. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and lifted one hand and tucked a strand of her hair, the same strand that had been falling out of its arrangement since last night, the one she had stopped bothering to correct, behind her ear. His fingers brushed the curve of her ear, the line of her jaw, and then dropped. Such a small gesture. She felt it everywhere. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the documentation specifically. For all of it." She understood this. For last night, and the cold tea, and the stay, and the morning, and the coffee, and the declaration offered in the blue-grey light before the day began. Thank you for all the things this room had held, and the things they were going to carry out of it. "Don't thank me yet," she said. I'm going to be very difficult about the process. I'm going to insist on procedure and transparency, and I'm going to argue with you about the legal framework at significant length. I know, he said. A trace of something at the corner of his mouth, the shadow of the thing that was almost a smile, the indication of warmth occurring just below the visible surface. I'm looking forward to it. She looked at him. The morning light, the open face, the serpentine cufflinks, fastened and still. The book of poetry on the desk behind him, the green cover and the worn spine, and the penciled margin note that was his mother's, or his own, or both. She thought about roads, about the moment before a choice is made, and how that moment becomes the thing you carry more than the road you eventually take. She had made her choice. She was standing in the aftermath of it, in the full and unforgiving light of the morning, and the aftermath was warmer than she had expected. They left the building together, which they had not done before. The door at the bottom of the stairs, the one with the black lacquered paint beginning to peel at the upper left corner. She had looked at that peel every week and thought of it as a private landmark, something belonging to her alone. She looked at it now and thought, he has also been looking at this. All the weeks she had stood on the outside of this door, looking up at the amber light of the second-floor window. He had been on the other side of it, looking at the same peel, carrying the same geometry of arrival and waiting. The realization did something particular to the inside of her chest. She did not have a precise name for it. She let it be unnamed. Callaway Lane in the morning was different from Callaway Lane in the evening rain. The puddles had settled into their permanent positions, the long one along the left curb, the smaller ellipsis near the lamppost, and reflected not sodium orange, but the grey-blue of the clearing sky, and the air smelled of wet stone and the beginning of May, that specific threshold fragrance of a month that cannot decide between winter and warmth, and ends up being both simultaneously. They stood on the pavement outside the door. She should go left. He should go right. These were the directions the day required. Neither of them moved immediately. She looked up at the building, the second-floor window, the warped glass, the lamp extinguished, the room behind it cooling now toward its neutral temperature, reverting to the ordinary space it had been before two people began bringing their Thursdays into it and leaving something of themselves behind. Not neutral, she thought. Not anymore. Some rooms are changed by what happens in them. Some rooms become their own history. Thursday, she said. He looked at her, brow fractionally elevated, the question without the word. There's a pub near the ministry, she said. Not the ministry pub. One further south on Aldwych with a green door. I've been meaning to go for months, and I haven't, because I've been going to Callaway Lane instead. She held his gaze steadily. Thursday evening, the one with the green door. Understanding moved across his face. Not surprise, but recognition, the specific quality of someone receiving a thing they had hoped for and had not allowed themselves to assume. Not the ministry subcommittee, he said. No, she said. Nothing to do with the ministry subcommittee. Not artifact legislation. Emphatically not. Just... He paused. The shadow at the corner of his mouth, and then in the May morning air, in the full and ordinary light of a city going about its business, it arrived. The actual smile, not the indication or the shadow or the almost. The real thing, which she had been accumulating evidence for and had not yet, until this moment, seen in its complete form. It was, she noted, with a precise and helpless accuracy that was simply who she was, devastating. "Just Thursday," he said. "Just Thursday," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment in the morning light, with that open face and the smile still present, and she looked back with the feeling in her chest that still did not have its proper name, and which she was beginning to think did not need one. Some things are more accurately held than labelled. Then he reached out and took her hand. Briefly, a few seconds, no more. The warmth of his palm against hers, the deliberate quality of the touch, the closing of fingers that had reached for each other last night across a quarter-inch of charged air and had found, in the finding, something neither of them had been entirely prepared for. He released her hand. She let him, because the release was not an ending. It was a punctuation, a comma rather than a full stop, a pause between one thing and the next thing that was also this thing. Continuing. She went left. He went right. She did not look back immediately. She walked half the length of Callaway Lane with the morning air against her face, and the smell of wet stone and May, and the particular interior warmth of someone carrying something that has finally been allowed to be what it is. At the corner, she looked back. He had also stopped, also looked back. The length of the lane between them, the puddles in their permanent positions, the lamp-post with its extinguished light, the building with its black lacquered door and its peeling paint and its second-floor window, gone dark. And across it, at the opposite end, the figure of a man who had gone out at 5 in the morning for coffee and had a book of poetry with a penciled margin, and had stood in the centre of a room to offer his exposure without guarantee, and who was standing now at the far end of a wet May lane, looking back at her with the expression of someone who has been to the edge of a junction and chosen the road that was not safe but was simply, unambiguously true. She raised her hand. Not a wave, something smaller and more specific than a wave, an acknowledgement. "I see you. I am here. Thursday." He raised his. Then they both turned, and the lane was between them, and the morning was fully committed to itself, and the world was doing what it had always been going to do, proceeding, arranging itself into its next shape, carrying all its conflicts and complications and necessary difficulties forward into the week. She walked toward it. She walked toward it with his hand's warmth still present on her palm, and the accurate and finally permitted knowledge of what she was carrying, and the specific and sustaining warmth of a morning that had been, in every way that mattered, worth staying for. Behind her, Callaway Lane held its quiet. The building held its room. The room held its amber, even now, even emptied. The particular quality of a space that has been used for something true and retains in its walls and its worn upholstery and its warped window glass the residue of it. Some things, once they have been what they are, cannot quite go back to being anything less. She had known this about rooms. She was learning it now about people. The morning opened around her, wide and grey and full of weather, full of everything the week was going to require. And she walked into it without armour, without the usual scaffolding of certainty and preparation, with nothing but the accurate and living knowledge of what was true. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was In fact, everything.
This story is about one night before everything changes. Draco and Hermione know that tomorrow will be hard. They know they are on different sides. They know the world will put them apart, but they choose to stay, just until morning. I think we all know this feeling, that feeling when you want to stop time, when you are not ready for tomorrow, when one more hour feels like a gift. Draco is not a hero in this story, he is just a man who made mistakes, who carries guilt, who learned slowly how to be honest. Hermione is not perfect either, she is strong, but she is also afraid of feeling too much, afraid of losing herself, and I think that is why they walk. Two people who are both trying, both scared, both choosing again and again to stay in the room. There is a moment in this story, a very small moment, his finger touches hers. Just the age, just for a second. That moments took 3 months to arrive. I believe the small moments are the real ones, not the big speeches, not the dramatic gestures, just a hand, a cup of tea made at 5 in the morning, a word that finally gets said out loud. Stay. That is the whole story, really. Sometimes love is not a feeling, it is a decision made quietly in a warm room before the morning comes. Thank you for listening.